Welcome to the debate. Right now, millions of runners around the world are, strapping on shoes engineered with aerospace-grade carbon fiber and highly resilient polymers.
Yeah, the super shoes.
Exactly. And they are entirely convinced that they're protecting their joints, running faster, and basically embracing the pinnacle of biomechanical engineering. But what if the very technology designed to save our knees is fundamentally altering and perhaps even damaging the structural integrity of our feet?
Right, and that is the exact paradox we are diving into today. We're looking at a fundamental split in how we understand human movement. I mean, do we treat the human body as a fragile machine that requires artificial protection and technological enhancement from its environment?
Or do we view the human body, specifically the foot, as this exquisite, evolutionarily perfected mechanism that functions best when we, just strip away all the synthetic interventions?
Precisely.
So to explore this, we're unpacking the fierce biomechanical dispute between traditional, highly cushioned running shoes, including the latest era of advanced footwear technology, or AFT, and the barefoot or minimalist running movement.
And we're grounding this discussion in extensive source material, right? Clinical studies on running economy, evolutionary biology research from Harvard Skeletal Biology Lab, and long-term biomechanical field tests that actually track runner injury rates.
Yeah, and the stakes here are incredibly high. I mean, for decades, the assumption has been that putting more material between the runner and the pavement just equates to better health and efficiency.
Which is exactly what I'm pushing back against. I look at the evolutionary baseline, and I take the position that removing artificial cushioning actually restores a natural, injury-resistant gait. By relying on our innate biomechanics, we can absorb force safely and efficiently without the need for, a synthetic crutch.
And I look at the clinical data and the reality of the modern runner's environment. I take the position that traditional running shoes and AFT represent absolutely necessary, highly measurable optimizations. I mean, engineered cushioning and carbon plate technology, they provide quantifiable metabolic advantages.
Right, but
And they offer essential structural protection against the repetitive, unyielding stress of running on modern surfaces like concrete and asphalt.
let's start by looking at what we consider the baseline of running. The modern cushioned running shoe was really only invented in the 1970s.
Which is nothing.
It's a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. For millions of years prior, humans were the apex endurance runners of the planet, and we achieved that barefoot. The introduction of the modern running shoe has severely distorted that evolutionary engineering.
I mean, distorted is a strong word.
But it's true. The research from Dr. Daniel Lieberman at Harvard Skeletal Biology Lab is incredibly illuminating on this exact point. His data shows that 75 to 87% of shod runners in traditional shoes, are rear foot or heel strikers.
Which, makes total sense given the elevated heel in most running shoes.
Exactly. Because of that wedge of foam under the heel, runners land with their foot flexed upward. By doing so, they experience this sudden, violent collision force roughly 1,000 times per mile.
Yeah, it's a lot of impact.
It's a massive impact transient. It's equivalent to 2 to 3 times their entire body weight just hammering directly into the skeletal system. But barefoot running naturally shifts the runner away from that damaging heel strike and forces a midfoot or a forefoot strike.
Right?
And when you make that shift, you begin to utilize the arch of the foot and the calf muscles as a highly efficient biological spring. And the result is almost no impact collision.
I completely understand the appeal of the evolutionary argument, I really do. But when we look at the clinical outcomes, the data simply does not support the idea that barefoot running is some magical shield against injury.
Well, it changes the type of injury.
But let's look at what modern shoes actually achieve. Let's look at the comprehensive 553-runner clinical study evaluating heel-to-toe drops. Researchers took this massive cohort of runners and split them into groups wearing a traditional 10mm drop shoe, a 6mm drop, and a 0mm minimalist shoe. And they tracked these runners across a 6-month period. Now, if the barefoot or minimalist geometry were vastly superior at preventing injuries, we would expect a massive divergence in the data, right?
Sure, if you're only looking at top-level numbers.
But they found absolutely no statistically significant difference in overall injury rates across the groups. None.
Yeah, but you're looking purely at the macro-level injury rates, without asking why those injuries are occurring or how the mechanics are fundamentally different. I mean, we have to look at the physics of the impact itself. Traditional heavily cushioned shoes fundamentally alter our spatiotemporal kinematics.
Hold on, let's unpack spatiotemporal kinematics for a second so we don't get lost in the weeds here. You're basically talking about how the foot moves through space and time, right? Literally how long the foot stays in the air, how long it stays on the ground, and exactly where it lands relative to the runner's center of gravity.
Precisely. Like if you're listening to this on a jog right now, pay attention to what part of your foot hits the ground first. If you're wearing heavily cushioned shoes, chances are your foot is landing well in front of your body and your heel is striking the pavement first.
Because the shoe lets you get away with it.
Exactly. And when the calcaneus, the heel bone, strikes the ground, the effective mass of the leg comes to a sudden, dead stop. In biomechanical terms, if we look at the vertical ground reaction force curve, we see a sharp, violent spike. That's the impact transient.
Right.
That rapid vertical loading rate sends a massive shock wave straight up the shin, directly up the kinetic chain into the knees and the hips.
Because there's no joint articulation at the heel to absorb it.
Right, it is bone colliding with ground. But when you take the shoe off, you simply cannot land on your heel. It is incredibly painful.
Oh yeah.
So your body naturally corrects. Barefoot running forces you to land on the forefoot or midfoot, with the ankle pointing slightly downward. This uses the ankle joint as a pivot. When you land on the forefoot, the heel slowly lowers to the ground.
So you're spreading out the force.
Yes, you're increasing the duration of the impact phase. By expanding the time over which the deceleration occurs, you drastically reduce the peak force. You are actively decreasing the effective mass of the foot coming to a sudden stop.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I don't disagree with the Newtonian physics you're describing regarding the reduction of the impact transient at the heel.
Right.
But here is where the biomechanical narrative of the barefoot movement often gets overly simplified and frankly a bit misleading. Barefoot running does not eliminate the force of the human body falling toward the earth. It merely displaces it.
Displaces it to tissues designed to handle it?
But designed under very different historical conditions. Let's think about this like a suspension bridge. If you remove a structural pillar in the middle of the bridge, the weight of the traffic doesn't just magically disappear.
No, of course not.
The load is instantly transferred to the suspension cables. When you shift from a rear foot strike in a cushioned shoe to a forefoot strike barefoot, you are indeed taking the load off the knee and the palato-femoral joint. I completely concede that.
Thank you.
But you are transferring that exact same mechanical burden directly to the intrinsic muscles of the foot, the Achilles tendon, and the calf musculature.
Which, again, are explicitly built to absorb that tension.
In theory, yes. But let's look at what happens in reality. We see this exact load transfer causing severe problems in the clinical literature. Look at the prospective study by Altman and Davis, which follows over 200 runners for a year. What they found was fascinating.
The calf injury data.
Exactly. The barefoot runners indeed had fewer knee and hip injuries, but they suffered a statistically greater number of injuries to the plantar surface of the foot, the Achilles tendon, and the calves. The total mechanical work being done by the body to arrest its downward momentum hasn't vanished. It has just been relocated to tissues that, for the modern runner, are highly vulnerable and prone to failure.
I come at it from a different way. I absolutely don't dispute the Altman and Davis findings regarding calf and Achilles injuries, but we have to contextualize why those specific tissues are failing. Those injuries are not an inherent biological flaw in the barefoot mechanical model.
Then what are they?
They're a classic presentation of too much, too soon. You have to remember, the modern human foot has profoundly atrophied.
Because of the shoes, you're saying?
Because we spend decades walking around in what are essentially padded casts. Traditional shoes support the arch artificially. That means the intrinsic foot muscles never actually have to work to support the body's weight. So when a recreational runner suddenly decides to take off their supportive shoes and run 5 miles on their forefoot, of course the Achilles and the metatarsals are going to complain, or even fail. The biological spring has been completely deconditioned, but that is a training error. That is a failure of adaptation, not a biomechanical deficit in the barefoot model itself.
But isn't that distinction purely academic if the outcome is still a massive rate of injury for the end user? Because barefoot running shifts such an immense mechanical burden to the foot and calf, we are forced to ask if the modern human foot can safely handle this load without artificial support in a real-world concrete environment.
With time, yes.
But the clinical reality is that the short-term injury risks of minimalist shoes are severe. We are talking about clinical studies showing significant bone marrow edema, which is literally bruising deep inside the bone marrow because the bone isn't conditioned to handle the impact. And we see severe metatarsal stress fractures appearing in runners who attempt this transition.
Which again points to a lack of proper transition.
But it's not just about transition, it's about structural realities. The podiatric community strongly warns that barefoot running is fundamentally unsafe for specific anatomical profiles.
Such as?
Well, if a runner has naturally severe flat feet, hypermobile joints, high rigid arches, or active plantar fasciitis, their foot simply lacks the structural integrity to absorb that shock safely, no matter how slowly they transition.
I see.
For those individuals, engineered cushioning and arch support are not just comfort features or, padded casts. They are functional, necessary tools to prevent pathological tissue breakdown.
The podiatric warnings you mention often treat the foot as a completely static structure, as if a flat foot or a weak arch is a permanent, unchangeable state of being. But the human foot is incredibly dynamic. We are talking about an intricate structure containing 26 bones, 33 joints, and over 100 distinct muscles, tendons, and ligaments.
It is complex. Absolutely.
Right, and clinical studies show that a slow, highly structured, gradual transition to minimalist footwear, spanning anywhere from 10 to 12 weeks or even up to 6 months, actually rebuilds the intrinsic foot muscle volume. You are effectively hypertrophy training the foot, just like you would lift weights to build a bicep.
Assuming the runner has the patience to endure a 6-month rehabilitation protocol just to go for a jog.
It is an investment in long-term resilience. Moreover, as you rebuild that muscle, you are vastly improving proprioception. Proprioception is the neurological sensory feedback loop between the sole of the foot and the brain.
Right, feeling the ground.
Exactly. When you have an inch of synthetic foam dampening that sensory input, the nervous system is flying blind. The body cannot make the crucial micro-adjustments needed to navigate terrain safely. Barefoot running restores that neurological feedback loop. The edema and stress fractures you mentioned, they occur exclusively because people ignore the adaptation phase. If you treat barefoot running as a long-term structural rehabilitation program rather than a weekend experiment, the body adapts, the arch strengthens, and the reliance on artificial support diminishes completely.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the ultimate goal of this adaptation. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that a runner successfully navigates this precarious 6 months transition without bruising their bone marrow or fracturing a metatarsal.
Okay?
They've successfully strengthened their intrinsic foot muscles and improved their proprioception. The next logical question we have to ask is, does this evolutionary gait actually translate to better performance? If the unassisted biological foot is the ultimate performance engine, as you suggest, it should make us faster and more efficient.
It does.
Yet, when we look at the rigorous data on running economy, which is the amount of oxygen and metabolic energy required to maintain a given pace, the claims of barefoot superiority really begin to unravel. And this is especially true when we introduce advanced footwear technology into the equation.
I suspect we're going to look at the exact same energetic principles here, but draw very, very different conclusions about what is best for the runner.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because laboratory tests unequivocally show that AFT, the so-called super shoes, consistently lower the metabolic cost of running compared to both traditional racing flats and barefoot mechanics.
Because of the plates.
Yes, let's look at how they do this. These shoes combine incredibly compliant, resilient foams with curved, highly rigid carbon fiber plates embedded right in the midsole. Together, they create what biomechanists call stiffer global spring mechanics.
Right, by artificially stiffening the foot.
By optimizing the energy return. When the runner lands and loads their weight onto the shoe, the foam compresses, storing kinetic energy. The curved carbon plate acts like a rigid lever, or almost like a diving board. It specifically stiffens the metatarsal phalangeal joint, the big toe joint. Normally, when you push off barefoot, your toe bends,
and metabolic energy is lost to that flexion. The carbon plate prevents that bending, acting as a lever to forcefully launch the runner forward. It returns a massive percentage of that mechanical energy directly back to the runner. The biological Achilles tendon is magnificent, but it simply cannot match the energy return of these engineered polymers without fatiguing over long distances, like a marathon.
Well,
The shoe is literally performing a percentage of the mechanical work that the human calf would otherwise have to do. The data shows AFT improves running economy by an astounding 2.8 to 4.4%.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the AFT model is a flawless victory for running mechanics. Yes, I fully acknowledge the speed benefits. A 4% improvement in running economy is staggering for an elite endurance athlete. It breaks world records.
It absolutely does.
But we have to look at the massive physiological trade-off being made to achieve that localized metabolic advantage. Advanced footwear technology introduces entirely novel, severe skeletal risks that we are only just beginning to understand in the clinical setting.
Because the mechanics are novel?
Because you're fighting human anatomy. By inserting a highly rigid, unyielding carbon plate into the midsole, you are fundamentally overriding the foot's natural flexion. As a direct result, sports medicine clinics are now seeing a disturbing rise in navicular bone stress injuries among runners using these super shoes.
Oh, the midfoot issues.
Yes, the navicular is a crucial wedge-shaped bone in the midfoot. It evolved to distribute weight, not to be levered violently against a stiff sheet of carbon fiber thousands of times an hour. You are sacrificing the long-term structural health of the midfoot for a short-term metabolic advantage.
I admit that the introduction of high-stiffness plates requires the foot to act differently. The biomechanics change, and yes, there is an adaptation required for AFT just as there is for barefoot running. But the metabolic advantage is simply not trivial.
But let's look closely at running economy from the barefoot side, because there is compelling data showing that human biology can absolutely compete with advanced technology if it is properly conditioned. A key factor in running economy that gets ignored in these shoe debates is the actual mass of the shoe itself.
The weight.
Right. There is a well-documented mass penalty in footwear science. For every 100 grams of weight added to the foot, running economy declines by roughly 1%. The heavier the shoe, the more energy it takes to swing your leg forward. Barefoot running obviously eliminates that mass penalty entirely.
But most studies show barefoot runners still expend more energy overall.
Because the studies are deeply flawed. I mean, most laboratory tests simply ask shod runners to take off their shoes and run on a treadmill immediately. Obviously, that yields poor running economy because their neuromotor pathways haven't adapted to the new movement pattern.
That's fair.
But let's look at the research when adaptation is factored in. A specific study evaluated runners who underwent a structured 4-week familiarization period with simulated barefoot running. After they were properly adapted, their running economy actually improved by 6.9% compared to their baseline in traditional shoes.
Wait, a 6.9% improvement?
Yes, that proves that when you remove the artificial weight at the end of the pendulum, the foot, and properly restore the natural biological spring of the arch and Achilles, human biology offers an incredible efficiency advantage of its own.
That 6.9% improvement after familiarization is fascinating, and I think it highlights the brain's incredible ability to optimize movement. But we have to ask if that efficiency scales compared to modern cushioning. The metabolic cost of cushioning hypothesis has been tested extensively.
Right.
Researchers have conducted studies where they added tiny lead weights to the feet of barefoot runners to exactly equal the mass of a cushioned running shoe.
Okay.
When both the barefoot runner and the shod runner had the exact same mass on their feet, the cushioned shoe still won out energetically.
How so?
Because of the dampening effect. When your foot strikes the ground, high-frequency vibrations travel up your leg. To protect your bones and joints, your leg muscles have to forcefully contract to absorb and dampen those vibrations. That muscle contraction costs metabolic energy. In a highly cushioned shoe, the foam absorbs the vibration, effectively saving the muscle from having to do that dampening work. So while barefoot running does eliminate the mass penalty, traditional and AFT shoes compensate for their own weight by performing mechanical dampening work on behalf of the runner.
And that dynamic right there is exactly where our core philosophies diverge. You see the shoe performing the mechanical work as a brilliant benefit. You see it as a helpful outsourcing of biological labor. I see that exact outsourcing as the root cause of the fragility we see in modern runners.
Because the body adapts to the lack of stress?
Exactly. When you continuously outsource the dampening work to a synthetic block of foam, the neurological system dulls. The intrinsic muscles of the foot weaken because they are no longer required to fire. The ligaments lose their robust natural elasticity. You are creating a biological dependency on a product.
But a very effective product.
For race day? Maybe. Yes, advanced footwear technology might help you cross the finish line of a marathon using marginally less oxygen today, but at what cost to the structural integrity of your foot tomorrow? The Barefoot model isn't just about chasing race day efficiency, it's about building a self-sustaining, deeply resilient runner who isn't fundamentally reliant on an annual $250 technological intervention just to avoid injury.
But we cannot ignore the physical environment we actually operate in today. We are not our ancient ancestors running on soft dirt, moss, and forgiving savanna grass. We are running on asphalt, concrete, and highly unforgiving modern urban surfaces.
True, but
To suggest that a modern recreational runner who sits at a desk in stiff shoes for 8 hours a day can simply rebuild their foot to handle 30 miles a week on concrete without highly engineered cushioning is frankly ignoring the clinical reality of the injuries we see in practice.
I have to point out that the assertion that barefoot running cannot be safely done on hard surfaces is actually a very common misconception. The Harvard data explicitly noted this. Because a proper forefoot strike expands the impact time and essentially eliminates the violent impact transient, a properly trained barefoot runner can sprint on the world's hardest surfaces, even steel or concrete, without the slightest discomfort. The hardness of the ground surface matters far, far less than the biomechanics of how your foot actually lands.
Which brings us to a complex but necessary summation of the evidence we've discussed today. As we step back and look at the breadth of this debate, I think we have to acknowledge that the landscape of running biomechanics is intensely complex and deeply individualized.
Absolutely.
From my perspective, I acknowledge that minimalist running undeniably has clinical value. It is fantastic for strengthening intrinsic foot muscles and improving proprioception. However, modern traditional shoes, and specifically advanced footwear technology, offer superior, undeniably quantifiable metabolic advantages. They provide necessary structural protection, vibration dampening, and energy return for the vast majority of modern runners whose anatomy, history, and urban environment simply do not support the massive biomechanical shift required to safely run barefoot.
And to summarize my perspective, I firmly believe that stripping away artificial, highly engineered cushioning is the fundamental key to restoring the body's natural evolutionary gaits. By shifting away from the shoe-induced heel strike and toward a forefoot or midfoot strike, barefoot running drastically reduces the harmful impact transients that have traditionally destroyed runners' knees and hips. While I fully admit it demands patience, respect, and a highly gradual period of physical transition, ultimately it builds a stronger, more resilient, and self-sustaining runner who relies on their own remarkable biology rather than a synthetic crutch.
I think where we absolutely converge today and what the data overwhelmingly supports is the understanding that no shoe, nor the complete lack of a shoe, is a magic bullet for injury prevention. The physics of running are absolute. The kinetic force of arresting the human body in motion must go somewhere.
Precisely. We are in total agreement on the physics. We are fundamentally talking about a choice in shifting the mechanical load. You either wear a highly cushioned shoe and load the knees and hips with the impact transients, or you take the shoe off, run on your forefoot, and load the foot, ankle, and Achilles tendon. The total energy doesn't disappear, it just changes addresses.
And so we remain in thoughtful disagreement over whether the ultimate solution to managing that load lies in continued technological intervention, improving the compliant foams, the carbon plates, and the shoe geometries, or in biological adaptation, forcing the human body to systematically rebuild its ancestral strength.
It is a fascinating, ongoing tension between human engineering and human evolution.
It truly is. It forces us to reflect on the incredible, almost unfathomable complexity of human biomechanics. There is likely no universally perfect approach to running footwear. The ideal solution may depend entirely on an individual's unique anatomy, their injury history, and their specific performance goals.
So true.
We highly encourage our listeners to dive into the source material themselves, examine the clinical studies we referenced today, and form your own conclusions on what goes on or comes off your feet.
Because at the end of the day, deeply understanding the mechanics of your own stride is the single most important step you can take for your longevity as a runner.
Exactly. It isn't just about what is absorbing the impact, it's about what kind of resilient system you want to build. Thanks for joining us on The Debate.